Is imprisonment working as an effective form, as the most effective form of punishment to the criminals in our society? Recently, we have seen a move towards a much rehabilitation route, leaning more towards community sentences for minor offences rather than prison sentences. And we're going to see whether, how this affects the reoffending rates and if people are able to rehabilitate into a society where crime is not accepted. So first, looking at the history of imprisonment, the initial emergence of the modern prison, Michael Foucault, who often was described as having a post-structuralist view in consideration of punishment, acknowledged the shift from corporal punishment, hanging, capital punishment, torture, to a more carceral form of punishment, which was prison. Used to be called workhouses, where people would go to be punished, but they would be forced through hard labour. And it introduced the initial emergences of the modern convict prison that we know today. Punishment previous to this, as I mentioned, violence, torture and death for even the minor offences such as forgery, which can be challenged through Beccaria's notion of proportionality, in the way that authorities should respond to criminal behaviour in a way that is proportion to the offence, so that the punishment should be, in proportion to the offence committed. However, the rational way of managing the social problem of crime cannot be recognised as the solitary reason for the development of prisons. The first prisons to be identified as the model that we are familiar with today was the Pentonville prison in 1842, which was the first prison in the Victorian era, and it followed the Penitentiary Act of 1778, and it orientated its regime around four primary foci, which was solitude, hard labour, religious indoctrination and surveillance, which is kind of showing that even though it was a model prison that we're familiar with today, the intentions are very much different, such as religious indoctrination you wouldn't find in a prison today, because there's a bit more freedom and rational choice. Its architecture was actually based around Jeremy Bentham's panopticon design, where there'd be a centre surveillance in the middle, and then the cells would be around the outside, so it sort of gave off this assumption that prisoners were being watched at all times, even if they weren't. It's crucial to note the differences in characteristics between the prison system in place currently and the Victorian model, because as society advances, so does the notion of crime and punishment. So here we have as well the diagram showing the Pentonville prison. So you see, even though it's not exactly the same as Bentham's panopticon, you still see that you have the middle and then the wings that come off on the side, which are the cells. So how do prisons function as the dominant form of punishment in society today? Incarceration has been the primary form of punishment since the movement away from punishment through inflicting pain on the body to inflicting punishment on the mind, in a sense. Although the question is posed of whether prisons are the most effective form of dealing with criminals. Cavadino consistently throughout his book mentions the supposed reality of a crisis, and a lot of criminologists are mentioning this penal crisis, which concerns issues of overcrowding, the population in general, poor conditions and understaffing. The most recent statistics published by the British government on Friday the 28th of December 2018 challenges the notion that the population is actually increasing. As you can see here, from the last 12 months, so last year, the population has actually decreased by about 2,000, which can be due to just harsher sentences, or the common assumption that, in fact, offenders do not fear the punishment of going to prison. So in contrast to the objectives of the Victorian model prison that we saw previously, the contemporary prison service aims to hold prisoners securely, reduce the risk of offending, and to treat prisoners humanely, which suggests a movement towards the acknowledgement of the offender's rights, which was absent in the Victorian model prison, and was certainly ignored when the use of physical punishment was used. The goals of punishment can be somewhat divided into two conflicting approaches, which is the retributist and the consequentialist approaches. So retributism can be explained through the straightforward expression of an eye for an eye sort of notion, implicating the concept of proportionality, as well as focusing on the extraction of retribution from the offender. So it's taking into consideration the crime at the present time and not taking into consideration the future and future offenders. Whereas a consequentialist orientate around the utilitarian philosophy of achieving a greater good in society, even if that needs to be gained through the suffering of one person. It is thinking about the future of society. Altering methods of punishment express a different focal demand. So, for example, community sentences take a very consequentialist approach, whereas imprisonment takes a very much retributist approach. This demand is derived from public opinion at the time, and therefore this talk of a penal crisis indicates that the public are completely dissatisfied with the system that is in place to sort of correct criminals. So is there an alternative punishment? As I've mentioned already, community sentences is the main one that's sort of challenging the prison notion at the moment. So there is a pressure implemented on the criminal justice authorities to seek an alternative, more effective punishment. Community sentences have rapidly increased in a number over the past 30 years, and following the Criminal Justice Act of 2003, a variety of sentencing options have been put in place, comprising of community rehabilitation order, the community punishment order, and the community order. And here we have, I referenced here, there's a punishment and reform government response by the Ministry of Justice, saying that there's a primary demand from the public concerning the punishing of criminal behaviour is more in achieving protection and safety for others in society. Again, taking a consequentialist approach, because the public in this response suggests that there is not enough in prisons to challenge offenders. And this is again confirmed by I looked at the reoffending rates bulletin of October 2016 to December 2016, in which admits that released from custodial sentences of less than 12 months have proven a reoffending rate of 64.5%, which is over half of people going back to prison after not even 12 months of being released. which kind of highlights an ineffectiveness of prison itself. So now we're going to look at the debate between the advantages and disadvantages of imprisonment versus community sentences. They differ in area of strengths and weaknesses, and it is apparent that community orders for minor offences tackle the cost issue that has been brought up by a number of criminologists over the years, and with government as well, because prison is a costly way of dealing with criminals, especially with the overcrowding and overpopulating issue. There is a need for more prisons to be built, to be sustained, and it also eases the pressure that's placed on the prison service. As I said, the consequences have a preference to use community issues. It prioritises the future of punishment in society. And what I found interesting is the BBC included the story of an offender whose community service dramatically improved their English and math skills that were absent before in their lives. And that contributed to the rehabilitation back in society, and believe he became I think it was a plumber, which going into work is going to help with the movement away from deviance. Nevertheless, it is debatable whether community sentences are too lenient on criminals. The proportionality is imbalanced. Is there that imbalance there between the offence and the punishment? This can be credited by a study conducted by Birmingham University academics, which found that tougher sentences, particularly for burglary, reduce crime, which is quite a big statement to make in crime in general. And due to the variation in objectives between incarceration and community orders, this causes a conflict in regarding what is the most important and crucial objective that punishment needs to meet. Is it preventing crime, protecting society, or is it retribution? This is drawn to attention by Hudson. Sorry, it keeps drawn to attention by Hudson by stating that there is an unavoidable tension, and there always will be this unavoidable tension between protecting the rights of the offenders not to be punished more than they deserve to be, and those rights of concern and the protection of the public. There is a conflict of rights. Whose rights are most important in these circumstances?